And also at the end, thank you. And also at the end of the webinar, there will be a short survey we would like you to complete to tell us whether this particular webinar was valuable, which we know it will be for everyone here. And also moving on to the next slide, which is just for those who are French speaking. I am, of course, Anglophone. I know a little bit Français, just a little bit, un peu. But for those of you who would like to go on the French channel of this webinar, you can switch between the languages. If you go to the bottom, there next to the record button, there's interpretation. If you click on that icon, you can choose which language you can go between. So for those of you who'd like to listen in French, there are translators there who are translating as we speak, so you can engage and participate in this particular webinar. I think on that note, we move to the agenda of the forum, and I've been talking about my sister Euphrasia. So over to you, my sister. Introduce yourself so everyone knows who it is I've been talking about. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Buti, for a good job done. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Euphrasia Luseka. I am a water governance specialist by profession, and I'm also the RWSN Leave No One Behind core thematic lead. Again, I would just want to reiterate that we are really happy to have you on board, and we are hoping that this webinar is going to be useful for you. Indeed, attaining safe water for all is a question of reducing inequalities. It's a question of social justice. It's a question of leaving no one behind. Unfortunately, the vulnerable groups in fragile states and in the conflict-affected areas are still being left behind in all ways. And this is basically on the human right to water mainly, but indeed, there are opportunities to change the status quo through quality data and supporting governments meaningfully, as it's going to be demonstrated in this webinar. And as we move to the next slide, I would like to mention that this is a webinar that has been inspired by the great work of these fellow WASH experts that you can be able to see on the screen. Besides that, also others who are out there, and we are telling the untold stories and experiences to support us reflect on which approaches can effectively be leveraged and scaled to strengthen governments' monitoring activities towards increased availability of high quality data for evidence-based policymaking, planning, and investments of all government levels. And at this juncture, it is my humble role to welcome Mr. Muyatwa Sitali to give the opening remarks. This man, he really makes me so proud to be an African in the water sector. Muyatwa is the head of the country and the partner engagement of sanitation and water for all. I believe we have seen his faces nearly everywhere. He is a development policy specialist who has also worked with UNICEF, World Bank, Oxfam, and Jubilee Zambia, drawing his experience from multiple sectors and countries. At SWA, he is involved in mobilizing political, policy, and programmatic support for water, sanitation, and hygiene. And this is in almost 80 countries in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, and Americas. And I'm glad the participants today are also coming from all these continents. Sitali has 15 years in the sector, and he has done an incredible job on issues to do with development finance, in multi-stakeholder partnerships, in peace and development, and the connections between humanitarian and development programming. Muyatwa, the floor is yours.
Euphrasia, thank you so much for that generous introduction. It's really a pleasure to work with you and to work with the colleagues who have put together this fantastic and timely conversation. I think that the timing could not have been more perfect, given we've just come from the UN Water Conference, and we are looking very much into the 2030 agenda with a renewed sense of urgency. I think among fragile and conflict-affected countries, this agency has always been there. They live with the challenge of having to deliver water and sanitation in extremely difficult circumstances, faced with danger and other risks, including risks of continuing accessing water and sanitation that is of questionable quality, and that might lead to additional health challenges. So I think that the timing is perfect. I think that the focus is also extremely well thought through. And I have just one slide which is on your screen today, and I will I will make some remarks which I will also relate to what you can see on your screen. Now, I think one thing that I wanted to start with is just to highlight that the percentage of fragile, conflict and violence affected countries that met the water supply Millennium Development Goal compared to those countries that are in the developing state but that are stable, it was 28% in fragile conflict affected countries and 60% in the other set of countries. You could already see the huge gap in terms of pace, and you could see that when you're looking at progress, fragile conflict affected countries can also be left behind, and there are a number of reasons related to that, and I will speak to about what I'm calling the 5 conundrums, but I will be very quick. Now, conflicts, economic crisis, and natural disasters in low-income countries not only leave water supply infrastructure damaged, but also significantly affect government capacity to plan, to track, and deliver basic services. These crises, whether they're acting individually or together in multiple factors, they can also impact coordination processes. They can limit the capability to generate data and use it effectively in order to achieve effective service delivery. They also can impact the capability of agencies to turn money into services. So for conflict affected countries, they find themselves at the confluence of a number of challenges. Consequently, this severely impacts the understanding of decision makers on who has access or not, on the functionality of the systems, where investments need to be made or where investments are making a difference or not making a difference. There isn't one linear way out of fragility, and this is why this slide, which was produced by the World Bank, I believe, in 2011, which shows that when you have a factor that can cause an emergency or that can exacerbate the fragility, you're getting to a spiral of relief, recovery, and development. It's not a single one-way unidirectional path. You might be able to move up and then fall back again into some levels of low delivery or low capacity or whatever problem that may be. So there isn't one way, one linear way out. The path out of fragility or the link between emergency and development is not a linear sequence. You cannot make steps forward. You can make steps forward and take several more backwards. Institutions do fail. Data quality can be questionable for a long time. And sometimes you have partners who can't follow even when governments have begun to lead, consequently exacerbating the coordination conundrum. And yet, to effectively communicate the benefits of stability or the peace dividend in the case of conflict-related fragility situations, or just to plan your interventions, you need data and evidence that can be used for decision-making. This data and evidence can also be used to generate interest and support from both internal and external decision makers. One Minister of Finance told sector stakeholders, by sector I mean stakeholders working in water, sanitation, and hygiene. So a finance minister told sector stakeholders in a country in Africa, which I will not mention, the finance minister basically said, no data, no money. And this was after the finance minister had just increased the budget for the water sector. So it was coming at the right time, but it was also stressing the point that you need to provide the data for there to also, for us as the Ministry of Finance to gain better visibility in terms of the results that you're getting, but also for us to be able to better communicate the benefits that we're seeing in other parts of the economy. This is powerful because it points to the fact that even finance ministers base their decisions on what we are measuring, how we are doing it, and what results we are getting. So sometimes we're not measuring not just for our own benefits, and data is not good just for data's sake. It is good for different other purposes. Now, in the long term, there are questions in moments of fragility for several service providers, whether they want to provide short-term to get results that they can communicate. And sometimes that short-term focus can miss the big picture, aiming for the trees instead of the forest, and that in itself can be a problem. So there ought to be a balance between the long term versus the short term. Is the funding or support or engagement around data and monitoring, is it focused on achieving long-term, short-term benefits, or is it focused on creating systems that will in the long term be able to be sustainable, to be able to measure the right items and follow through on different requirements in order for there to be a robust system? This brings us to the crucial point of monitoring in situations of fragility. And here I would like to cover a set of conundrums, what I'm calling the 5 conundrums. And the first is the leadership. Who takes the leadership for generating data, turning data into evidence and using it for decision makers? Is it one institution? Is it a set of institutions? Is it one person? And how is that chain connected so that the data is not just for the data's sake, but it also ends up with decision makers? Now, there cannot be a one single response for different contexts. I think the point is that leadership is a crucial part, especially even including political leadership, because that's where decisions need to be made also regarding financing, regarding resource allocation, and regarding addressing targeting to deal with the leave no one behind. There's also the data and results conundrum itself. What is the quality of the data that is being measured? If you're monitoring, what are you monitoring? Where and how are you using this data for generating reports that can effectively communicate results? So there's a very strong link between the data and results itself that we need to be able to, we need to have the leadership, but we also need to connect the data to the results overall that we're seeing. The capacity conundrum, which is gathering, collecting, and using data effectively, does not just happen in a vacuum. It requires capacity for this to be effectively done. Sometimes the quick shift to newer tools that might be shiny, it may not be the first or best response, but it may also be a response. It doesn't mean that it's not the response. It just means that it needs to be planned well in terms of what capacities are required in order to use the right tools in different contexts. And this capacity conundrum can itself create a vicious cycle where if there's no capacity, there's no absorption of resources, and therefore it takes us back to the finance minister who tells us no data, no money. The resource, and this takes us then to the resource conundrum, that we need to understand this as a whole set of a system of factors at play, that one aspect can affect the other. Without resources in one area can affect resources in others. And then the institution conundrum, just the fact that institutions are at the center of this process. In the interest of time, I think this is what I wanted to highlight, and also to highlight the fact that in a lot of fragile situations, working in a coordinated fashion will help to provide a better way forward. Thank you very much, and I will end there. Thanks.
And have you officially opened the webinar?
Yes, the webinar is verily open. Please do, let's have a good conversation.
Thank you so much. Powerful indeed. No data, no finance, I add, no safe water for all. In the same breath, what I picked from the speech is that, and also what I really want to echo for the participant is that the declaration of the human right to water requires governments to own, to adapt, and to prioritize SDG 6. And through mutual accountability and collective action, indeed, governments can be able and they can actually be able, and again, should be meaningfully and efficiently supported towards attaining safe water for all. Thank you so much once again, Muyatwa. We now move to the presentation sessions. I always say systems are changed by people. They're not changed by themselves, and they're not changed by anybody. They're changed by very disruptive people, progressive people, innovative people, bold, courageous people. And we have them all in this presentation session. Kicking it off is Engineer Stephen Mudivwa. He is a WASH specialist with UNICEF, East and Southern Africa Regional Office, which which has programming oversight for around 21 countries. Stephen Muduviwa is qualified as a civil engineer and has over 20 years experience, mostly working in East and Southern Africa, focusing on technical, social, and institutional requirements for poor climate resilient water sanitation and hygiene, as well as the service provision entity. So please take it away, Steve.
Okay, yeah, thanks. If you could go to the presentation.
Greetings, colleagues. My name is Stephen Muduvio. I'm a WASH specialist with the UNICEF East and Southern Africa Regional Office. I'm based in Nairobi, Kenya. My presentation will focus on the 21 countries that represent UNICEF's East and Southern Africa region. Of the 21 countries, 7 are in a fragile and conflict-affected situation. 4 are conflict affected, that's Ethiopia, Mozambique, Somalia, and South Sudan, and 3 exhibit institutional and social fragility, that's Burundi, Comoros, and Zimbabwe. From year 2000 to year 2020, the East and Southern Africa region has seen a dramatic population growth from about 300 million people to about 550 million people. Urban population has also doubled from about 90 million people to close to 200 million people. There has been a big increase in number of people meeting basic access to water. However, the number lacking basic remains around 200 million, with most of these people being in rural areas. We also see that in the urban areas, most of those with at least basic are also safely managed. However, in the rural areas, only a small fraction have safely managed services. 6 out of the 21 countries have national estimates for safely managed drinking water. That's Rwanda, Ethiopia, Uganda, Lesotho, Madagascar, and Zimbabwe. Of the countries in a fragile or conflict affected situation, only Zimbabwe and Ethiopia have estimates for safely managed water supply, whilst 3 other countries in a fragile conflict affected situation have estimates for basic water supply services, which 3 countries include South Sudan, Somalia, and Madagascar. Of the data sources for national monitoring of drinking water in East and Southern Africa, we see that most countries for their data sources are household surveys and census surveys. And there are 2 countries, that's Eritrea and Lesotho, have no nationally validated data sources for SDG monitoring, though these countries are not classified as being in a fragile or conflict affected situation. Most countries regularly report on basic service level, plus some aspect on safely managed water services, typically if it's available on site. No country has monitoring data for access to water services, which fully aligns with the GMP indicators for safely managed services. The biggest limiting factor is the absence of routine monitoring data on water quality. This chart shows the number of WASH areas for which routine data is available alongside the average rating for the enabling environment and strength of the monitoring systems. What we are seeing is that a strong enabling environment does not necessarily mean that there are strong monitoring systems. For example, Ethiopia scores very good on all the factors for the enabling environment. However, we see that in terms of the strength of the monitoring system, there's some issues that need to be addressed in terms of data accessibility and use. South Sudan, generally, the enabling environment is poor. However, the strength of the monitoring systems from the review appears that it's good. There is at least the data that's available is being used to inform investments and decision making. Zimbabwe has a strong enabling environment, which is, and also the strength of their monitoring systems is good. The SR region, needs to invest 15 billion annually till 2030 to meet the SDG goals. And in so doing, I think there is need to access innovative financing from all actors, both commercial and government finance, as well as any form of blended finance. Challenges that are within the SR region include no costed wash plans and targets, which can inform on the investments decision making process. Systems to monitor, track and account for expenditures are not very strong. There are limited options to access development finance or commercial finance. And the monitoring systems need to fully align with the JMP indicators so as to build a strong case for targeted investments. Way forward, I think this is not exhaustive, but represents some of the main ideas that can come through, and I hope the discussion will also focus on the same. For governments, I think there's need to look at a system strengthening approach, strengthening also the enabling environment, looking at developing MI systems that fully align to the JMP. There's need to ensure that wash plans are costed and have the smart targets. There's need to look at options to improve wash sector financing, and also look at resource mobilization through sector strengthening, as well as looking at tax exemptions for the wash sector. There is need also to look at options to facilitate access to commercial finance, as well as government finance. And for CSOs, I think the focus should be more on advocacy, analytical work, with a system strengthening focus. There is need to also to monitor, track, and look at accountabilities for expenditures in alignment with the policy pronouncements. There's also need to look at concept proofing service delivery models. That's my brief presentations, and I would like to thank you, and hopefully we'll have an engaging discussions once it's open for discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for your wonderful presentation. I'm proud to see that I'm not the only civil engineer who's doing WASH full time. It's good to hear that we are many in the sector. A lot of interesting stuff from your presentation, Stephen. A couple of things that leapt up to me. Good data availability requires an enabling environment, but simply because you have an enabling environment doesn't mean you have good data availability. That's a very interesting, to borrow a word from the previous, from the opening remarks, a very interesting conundrum, a kind of catch-22. So it'll be interesting to try to unpack that a little further, but also interesting to see that we still have, at this point, with how many years? We have 7 years to the 2030 targets. And we still have governments that haven't aligned their MIS to their JMP. Something to talk about during the discussions. We move to our next presentation, which will be done by Dr. Annie Fury. Dr. Annie Fury is the CEO and co-founder of MWater, which is the largest wash data management platform in the world. At the moment, over 3,700 organizations, governments, and researchers use the platform, and about 19 million surveys have been collected with the platform. And Annie lives in Los Angeles, so it's sometime early in the morning right now. Over to you, Annie. Hello, Annie, we cannot hear you. I think you might be on mute.
I'm so sorry. I lost my mouse for a moment. I couldn't hear.
No, that's okay. And I think during the course of your presentation, if you could also introduce Miriam Beaufoy, I think she will be co-leading with you, and she is our Haitian connection. So I'll leave that to you to handle during your presentation. Over to you, Annie.
Thank you very much. I want to begin by saying my name is Annie Feary. I'm the CEO of MWater. We're talking today about SDG 6 monitoring in the capacity of fragile states. MWater has a free user base in 191 countries, but we also worked with 32 countries so far to build national management systems. And we're going to be talking to you from that experience base today. Sorry, there's a bit of delay. So I want to begin by just talking about when we say SDG 6 monitoring, we're talking about the generate stage of what MWater calls the data cycle. And the behind the generate stage is a lot of other stages that produce that data, and that involves government management systems. And so we'll introduce those today. When you think about your own work, it's helpful to start by thinking, how does your work get indicatorized? How does your work get reflected at the level of SDG 6? And when we're talking about WASH systems, we're really mostly talking about the data that's generated by frontline water workers. So first of all, what are government data management systems? Very literally, it's a data workflow that begins with a data entry tool that is used by frontline workers, and it ends with real-time data that's in a relational database that offers you opportunities for visualization, reporting, and analysis. Now, a few details about that database. It's owned by the government. This is sovereign data. And second, it's not usually one database. It's usually a cohort of many. In Uganda, for example, there are 14 different official databases that are used across the MWE to do various tasks. And this is normal. Think about your own office. You probably use a lot of different software platforms. And so we have to think about, it's very normal for governments to need a lot of tools and databases to manage something so big as a national water sector. Now, just as equally important, what are not government management systems? These are not the systems that you know of the NGOs build or donors run. They're not the decision-making tools that help donors decide how to achieve SDG 6. They're not the repositories of scraped or donated CSVs of data. You might think of like HDX as a giant donor repository. And they're not mandatory open data requirements. And this last one is tricky because we all want our governments to have the data free and open and transparent, but it's something that the government owns the data and has to make that decision too. They have to feel safe to, and it cannot be.
Oh, excuse me, Annie. Sorry, Annie, sorry to interrupt your flow. Could you switch on your camera? People want to see you.
I can, I think.
If it's possible.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So you can continue your presentation. You'll be spotlighted for people to see you. That's okay.
You bet.
Great.
Okay. So just getting back to this, these are all potentially extractive data practices, and that has to be, we have to be aware of that. It's a real danger to fall into neo-colonial practices of using data in a way that uses governments and doesn't include governments. Okay, whenever we talk about data management systems, how does it happen? How does the data get in there? The first stage is where the data is collected. This is frontline water workers. You might think of the people who go out to report on a water point, the pump mechanic who does preventative maintenance or maintenance, the water systems, asset systems worker who is checking for chlorination residual in the pipes. All of these people do their jobs by doing filling out a survey, filling out a form, filling out a checklist that are digital. These create digital relics of their work. It's the digital infrastructure for the physical infrastructure. This provides 90% of the data in a government management system, at least. From there, it is processed. A manager will then clean that data. If it's a survey that's filled out, for example, report on a water point, they might reject it and say it's not right or fix something. Or if they approve it, they're the bottleneck that moves local data to be approved, to be visible in the national MIS. And they also are very important people because they're the people who triage that first level of data and make decisions on things that need emergent or immediate action. From there, this is where most of the people I think that are on the call today probably exist in this analyze step. Here, the government, along with stakeholders like NGOs and donors, make maps, dashboards, charts that demonstrate the data and indicatorize the data. Indicatorized data is SDG 6 data. That's one of the indicators we look at. We also look at indicators like reduced non-revenue water, increased fee collection, and access, really importantly, access. And these indicators are where most of us that are international stakeholders get to work with the government and see what's going on. We hopefully are sharing the data in the form of dashboards that are live. We don't want to print it off as a PDF. It becomes dead data and begins to decay the moment that it goes offline. If we're sharing links to URLs of dashboards, we're all talking about and making decisions about live data. And then here's the secret sauce of the whole process: the data gets used. In our system, we ask the local, regional, and national teams of the government to all meet once a month and look at those dashboards and talk about why the indicators are going up and down. Where are your KPIs right now? And that creates a culture of data-driven management. And that's where the institutional transformation really happens, is those meetings and that monthly reporting and meeting process. So let me just show you to make it just more real for you what this looks like in real time. This is RWSN. This is an MIS that we're building right now with the government of Uganda. And you're looking at Lira district in Uganda, which has updated, the district has remapped the water atlas, and this is beautiful, accurate data. We can look at a water point in Lira, and we'll see where it is. We'll see the most recent photos that have been taken of it. If it's functional, it should be apparently functional in the photo. Any forms that have been filled out, like a drilling log, water user committee. We can see right now we're looking at form 1, which is kind of the bread and butter reporting form for Uganda, is here. All 121 fields, if you know form 1 on paper, how it used to be, are now a digital process. And anytime that this water point is visited or updated or repairs are conducted on it, we could see that digital process. And then let's look at how it looks for a water system. Here's an umbrella water system also in Lira. It's been mapped. It has 300 assets, part of it, that are mapped. Each asset has a page. The parent and child assets are all here. They have their own photo, their own condition. If you're going out to fix it, you should be able to know which parts you need. This is the process that I'm talking about in that data cycle. You can then see how it is indicatorized to show high-level indicators from the flow of visiting, checking on, and working on water points. So what I hope that you're seeing here is governments have a lot of capability to run management systems. They're doing great, but there are threats to, especially in fragile states, to government management systems. Let's talk about that last. Finally, in like a decade ago, when a lot of us here in this call started, there were code words that people had to talk about governments not being ready for advanced technology and monitoring systems. And that was appropriate technology. We would hear things like, sometimes the best technology is a pencil. But now we've finally moved to the stage where everybody agrees there should be a computer in every office and a smartphone in every pocket. But the new way that people talk about governments perhaps not being ready to or able to run their own management systems is verifiable data. And here's where people also will say maybe the government, maybe the donors should be the ones that run the real data. And so that's a real threat to government systems. Second is people who perhaps propose that private sector NGOs should be running the real data systems. And we want to point out that in the history of the world, the only way that anyone has scaled safely managed water to the national level is a government. That's the institution that's got to do it. And while there's very important roles for the private sector and NGOs to be collaborators and to increase features, increase functionality, the operating system is the government, and they have to own the data. Third, we're just talking again about extractive data. This is like a jewel in a mine that has been mined and taken out of the country. Data is that important. If someone is taking data without helping the government or working the government, that's extractive. That's a neo-colonial practice. And so how do you avoid that? You work with the government to use the government's indicators so that when you do a data collection event and you contribute your data to the government, it's comparable to their data systems. Even if you're doing academic research, especially, it should have a dissemination and collaboration stage in your work. And finally, emergencies. Emergencies are sometimes opportunities to bring funding and attention to data systems in a government, but they're also a threat. If, we've seen in cholera very recently, if the responding NGOs come and say, we've got better data systems, you should use ours, and then they don't share their data with the government. This is a real opportunity for policy change, to say that if you're coming to work on an emergency in this country, you need to either build a government management system and use it, or use the existing government management system. Now, here's an example of how that works in practice. In 2012, when the giant earthquake happened in Haiti, it caused the government to be severely out of control for several years, especially in the WASH sector. For 3 years, the NGOs and the clusters sort of subsumed government decision-making. When a similarly sized earthquake happened 2 years ago, the government of Haiti, the WASH sector, had a very strong data management system in place. And the then director, Myriam Defay, was very proactive the day of the earthquakes, made a survey, sent it out in the data system, said situational awareness right now. I want to know pictures and what happened. And NGOs and her staff all were able to respond immediately. 5 days later, the cluster response did show up and say, here's a data system you should use for your impact assessment. And she handed them the results and said, I've already done it. Here we go. Let's get to work. And it was a great example of everyone coming together and letting the government stay in charge of the relief process, and much success in that progress. Much of that credit goes to the strong leadership of Myriam, and I'm very happy to introduce her as our next speaker. The former director and now the CEO of her own business is Myriam Defay.
Over to you, Myriam.
Merci tout le monde. Bonjour. Je suis Myriam Defay et je suis là pour partager mes expériences en tant qu'ancienne directrice de l'Observatoire national de la DINEPA, parce qu'on a contribué à mettre en place un système de monitoring, de suivi et de données WASH en Haïti qui marche très bien jusqu'à maintenant. Autre slide, s'il te plaît. D'abord, pour commencer la mise en place du système, on avait eu pas mal d'ateliers de travail avec les différentes parties prenantes, les gens de la DINEPA, les gens des bailleurs de fonds du secteur WASH, les gens du gouvernement, les organisations aussi qui travaillent dans le secteur afin de définir les problèmes en termes de données qu'ils ont rencontrés et quelles sont aussi leurs priorités. Et de là étant, on avait vu qu'il y avait pas mal de priorités comme la gestion des systèmes privés et le système commercial aussi, parce que chaque système de la DINEPA, c'était individuel, il n'y avait pas un tronc commun. Et puis, la partie de gestion de qualité de l'eau, puisqu'il y avait déjà un système, mais ce n'était pas encore unifié. Et autre aspect technique, que les informations que nous pouvons rassembler dans le SIEPA pourraient faire remonter. Et après avoir défini les différents problèmes et priorisations selon les diverses parties prenantes, on a pu faire certains déploiements, interactions pour voir ce qui marche, ce qui ne marche pas, afin de s'assurer que le travail serait fait pour tout le monde. Et ensuite, au fur et à mesure qu'on avance avec le développement du système, on a intégré aussi de différentes demandes telles que le suivi financier des données, surtout pour les CTE. Et CTE en Haïti, c'est Centres techniques d'exploitation. Ce sont les systèmes urbains qui fait référence à cet style de méthode de gestion. Et aussi, on a pris en compte aussi les différents processus standards de la DINEPA et aussi tous nos partenaires, les bailleurs de fonds, afin d'avoir un alignement standard pour tout, une sorte de conformité pour toutes les structures de gestion et eau potable en Haïti. L'autre slide. Le système est intégré. On parle de système intégré parce qu'il y a plusieurs types de données. Il y a des données sur la gestion des systèmes d'eau qu'on appelle communément en Haïti SAEP, système d'approvisionnement en eau potable. Il y a aussi des suivis qu'on fait sur la partie rachat dans les institutions publiques, les écoles, les centres de santé, les marchés publics. On collecte aussi ces données pour suivre la gestion de ces institutions-là et répondre à leurs besoins. Et aussi sur la fonctionnalité des différents points d'eau au niveau national, parce que le système SIEPA pour le niveau national, c'est décentralisé parce que la DINEPA travaille au niveau des 10 départements du pays où il y a des représentants au niveau des différentes communes et ce sont ces représentants au niveau communal qui collectent ces informations et nous envoient ça à travers la plateforme MWater qu'on a utilisée pour asseoir le SIEPA pour remonter ça mensuellement pour certaines informations et pour d'autres informations, par exemple, l'inventaire des points d'eau en termes pour faire ressortir leur fonctionnalité, ça se fait annuellement. Et je profite aussi pour dire que les données collectées pour l'inventaire des points d'eau, ce sont ces données-là qu'on utilise pour calculer les indicateurs qui seraient servis à alimenter l'ODD 6.1 en termes d'accessibilité, qualité et la disponibilité de l'eau. Et pour l'assainissement, les deux indicateurs qu'on a pour l'instant pris en compte, ou bien à l'époque que j'étais à la DINEPA, qu'on avait pris en compte, c'était des indicateurs en termes d'accessibilité et le transport et le traitement des baux. Et il y a aussi des partenaires ONG qui travaillent au niveau communal et qui sont en mesure de rapporter à travers le SIEPA et pour nous faire savoir quel est l'état des communautés qui sont FDAL. FDAL, c'est une stratégie utilisée surtout en Haïti de concert avec l'UNICEF pour dire que certaines localités sont définies et fruits et boue. C'est-à-dire les gens ne font plus tata par terre, ne sont plus leurs besoins par terre, ils utilisent au moins un moyen décent, approprié pour faire leurs besoins en termes d'hygiène. L'autre slide. Avant le SIEPA, la DINEPA avait déjà des des mécanismes de collecte de données. Mais c'était tellement de manière séparée, on n'avait pas vraiment une structure permettant de relier les différentes informations pour avoir un système global. En 2017, il y avait un travail que j'avais supporté aussi de collecte des informations sur les différents points d'eau. C'est la première cote que vous voyez ici. Et avec l'arrivée du système SIEPA qu'on a commencé en 2019, on était en mesure, en outre d'avoir les points d'eau, de tracer le réseau sur la cote. C'est la deuxième cote que vous voyez ici. Et la version finale existante de nos jours, en outre des points d'eau, les réseaux, on a aussi la position des différents clients, ou du moins les bénéficiaires des systèmes, les différents clients des systèmes. Et aussi, on peut faire ressortir quelle zone qui a beaucoup plus, qui a une forte densité, ou en termes d'action, le gouvernement pourrait s'intéresser pour agrandir ou du moins apporter de l'eau à ces populations-là. Et tout ceci, c'est pour permettre de répondre aux exigences de l'ODD 6, parce que là, ils sont en mesure de voir clairement où est le problème et comment y remédier, s'il faut de nouveaux systèmes ou il faut vraiment investir. Là, le CEPA sert comme guide de décision pour permettre au gouvernement et aux partenaires, aussi les bailleurs de fonds du secteur WASH, de se positionner afin de répondre à l'objectif de l'ODD 6, qui est de permettre à toutes les gens, toute la population, d'avoir accès à l'eau en toute sécurité. L'autre slide. Là, comme je le dis auparavant, le CIEPA sert d'abord à alimenter les indicateurs de l'ODD en termes d'accessibilité et disponibilité et en termes de qualité de l'eau. Et pour la partie qualité de l'eau, il y avait déjà un système indépendant du CIEPA, mais maintenant qui est intégré au CIEPA, où on peut suivre journalièrement la qualité d'eau qui est distribuée qu'au niveau urbain qu'au niveau rural. Le CIEPA englobe de manière générique les deux milieux, milieu urbain et milieu rural. Et c'est ça qui fait vraiment la beauté du système, parce que en un clic, les données sont remontées au niveau national et le traitement se fait et sont disponibles sur la version visualisation qui est disponible à travers mWater.
Hello, Miriam, you've got 2 minutes to wind up. Thank you.
Okay. Et les données qui sont collectées, ils servent d'abord à faire des rapports mensuels à toutes les parties prenantes, qu'au niveau de la DINEPA, des partenaires, ils peuvent utiliser ces informations pour suivre aussi la performance du secteur et prendre des décisions. L'une des choses qui a été faite juste avant mon départ de la DINEPA et en septembre dernier, c'est que ces données ont été utilisées pour monter de nouveaux programmes pour le secteur, surtout pour le milieu rural. Je sais qu'avec la Banque mondiale, la BID aussi utilisait ces informations aussi pour asseoir leurs décisions afin d'aider à la tête de l'objectif 6 qui est donner accès à l'eau en toute sécurité à la population, incluant les gens du milieu rural. Merci.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, ladies. That was brilliant. That was just simply brilliant. I picked two things. It is important to decolonize WASH data, and Annie, you have been able to demonstrate that this is definitely very possible, and I've also done it with evidence. Secondly, what I've also been able to pick is the fact that credible, timely, and transparent data is a pathway to democratizing safe water access, as it provides an avenue to monitor trends that inform decision-making for water services. And this is now to all participants as well. We are kindly requesting you to share your views, share questions, share your comments, also quote the speakers who are delivering very well so far, quote them on social media, quoted on LinkedIn as well, and let's just keep the conversation going as we are learning from each other. Now, to bring us to a close, the presentation session, kindly allow me to introduce the last presenter, Helen Petam, a senior research manager at Rich Impact Initiatives. Helen has led humanitarian needs assessments in South Sudan, in Somalia, and in Bangladesh, and has worked in public health strategy with the UK Health Security Agency. Her work focuses on understanding the links between water access and different sectors to identify populations in need and understand the drivers of public health crisis. Please go ahead, Helen.
Hey, sorry, just adjusting my video there. Thank you. So my name is Helen and I'm a research manager with the Reach Somalia team. And I've been invited here to talk through the perspective of NGOs monitoring access to water in fragile contexts and conflict contexts. So I think I'm going to start with the slides.
Sorry, I've got to sort out your slides because we were going to play your video.
Oh, sorry. That also works well for me. Either is good.
No, hang on a second.
While our tech team is trying to resolve the technical situation and Helen is anxiously waiting to do her presentation, just as a reminder to everybody, you can put your questions in the Q&A section of this webinar. It's at the bottom toolbar. If you want to make a comment, it's in the chat section. I've seen a lot of excellent questions in the chat section. So please copy and paste them in the Q&A section of the webinar. And yes, the presentation is now up and running. Over to you, Helen.
So Helen, you can present now. Just tell me when you want to move the slides on.
Fantastic, thank you. So yeah, I'm happy to go to the first slide here. So the 3 points I want to talk through today are, firstly, I'm just going to talk through a few dilemmas and challenges that NGOs can face when trying to monitor access to water in a fragile context. And then I'm going to zoom in a bit on one of these kind of key questions, which touches on both the points being discussed today in terms of how do we monitor access to water for hard to reach locations and people who are at risk of being cut out of monitoring systems. And then finally, I'm going to touch on at the end, just talking through thoughts on ways that this can be improved with a particular emphasis on collaboration, which hopefully picks up on some of the points raised in the previous discussions. So that said, I'm good to go to the next slide. So this is just a bit of a framing for sort of the following slides that I'll talk through, just talking through a bit some of the questions that we face as NGOs when we're working to monitor access to water. The first one is how to maximize impact. Obviously, this is really critical for any research, any monitoring conducted ever, but it's one that's particularly pertinent in a fragile context because we're aware that some forms of data collection, for instance, a survey, can take up time for affected populations. And so we're asking for an hour of people's time when that could be used for livelihood activities, for instance. So we have to be extremely sure that there can be a benefit and a tangible link to action with the information that is collected, and that moral imperative grows stronger in fragile and conflict contexts. The next point is on number 2, which is how to increase inclusion. And this is the one that I will zoom in on a little bit more in the next slides. But essentially, the problem that we sometimes face in fragile and context environments is that the populations who are most difficult to physically reach are often the ones that are the most vulnerable and may have the most restricted access to needs, including sometimes access to water. Sometimes the reasons that populations are unreachable, say flooding, cutting off the roads, or conflict, can also have a direct impact on their needs. So it's absolutely critical that we find ways to include these populations in any monitoring systems. And often that then requires some innovation with the data, innovative methodologies in order to have at least an indication of what is happening in hard to reach locations. And finally, how to link to public health outcomes. It's something that we're often asking ourselves, that, and links back to this how to maximize impact, that when we think through the data that we have and what's the most that we can do with it, monitoring access to water can be really critical, but also thinking about needs in other sectors such as malnutrition or mortality, and how that data can be used, for instance, as an early warning system for higher risk of malnutrition or mortality is a question that we should always be asking ourselves what we're doing. Again, just linking that back to that question of how to maximize the impact of the work. On the how to maximize the impact, sorry, one last point on the previous slide there. Just sort of add an example of ways that we can try to do that better is, for instance, the Watch Cluster was very supportive in helping identify for a price monitoring system, what exactly were the items most needed and what kind of decisions were being made by partners that what items they most needed the price on. And so that's an example of some cooperation that can make sure the data is most linked to a decision. Thank you. Good to go on to the next slide. So in this slide, I've got an example of one of the methods we use to try and understand better levels of access to water in these hard to reach locations. This is the first example, and then I'll talk through remote sensing in a second. But in this case, it's the area of knowledge methodology. It's a methodology that we've developed over a few years. And the essential idea behind it is that we speak with key informants who have an understanding of the settlement, what is happening at the settlement level. These people will be identified partly through phone calling directly into the assessed settlement that cannot be reached directly. However, you do need to bear in mind with phone calling, there's a potential for bias. Sometimes the patterns of who has access to a phone can also align with things like higher income or greater status. And so we have to be careful that our data doesn't exclude people who say don't have access to phones. A way that we can counterbalance that is trying to have more than one key informant for each settlement, and also trying to source key informants through other ways, such as people who have been very recently displaced from a settlement. This can be particularly relevant if there's a sudden onset crisis and there's a large displacement. Going to the locations where people have moved to and speaking with them there can be one way to try and understand the needs in the locations that they have left. And finally, there is also a possibility to speak with people with regular contact to certain settlements. We do acknowledge that tends to be slightly less reliable than the other two methods. So it's one that we try to do as more as a triangulation rather than the only source of data that we would collect on that settlement. With that said, so we would then have this sort of triangulated level understanding of the needs in these different settlements. And what we really want to stress with that as well is that the understanding that this is something indicative. So we know it's not a representative household level survey with in-depth results. And the main purpose of this instead is to provide a rapid understanding of what's happening. So a rapid kind of flavor, and it can work as a red flag for any high needs. The example here is taken from Jamame in Somalia. It's a location that we're, for security reasons, not able to directly access. It's actually from October, a time when there's some serious needs and limited access to water due to drought in that location. And while we cannot say for definite that it's 99% of key informants lived in locations that did not have water, we also that where they're reducing water, we wouldn't want to say for definite it's 99%. However, the fact that it's that high is an alarm bell that there could be something quite serious happening here in terms of access to water. The 84% reporting drinking surface water is also quite a high figure there. So this helped highlight some of the needs. And then to make sure that that is then useful, we try to feed that into systems and group analysis, such as the IPC, where the government, as well as humanitarians and experts all come together to agree on what the appropriate food security and nutrition classifications would be for a location. So thank you, that's one example, and I'll talk through another example below with remote sensing. So for this slide, very quickly, it touches on remote sensing and how this can also be used for monitoring access to water. The pictures here show limited or reduction in rainfall compared to the average for the time of year. So helping identify hotspots where there's been lower rainfall. There's also one thing I'd give a shout out to if anyone's interested in this kind of remote sensing is SWALIM. It run in Somalia by FAO is a extremely interesting analysis for this remote sensing where they looked at a range of different factors and combine that into a drought index. So I'd also recommend having a look at that if anyone is interested in some of the ways that access to water can be remotely monitored. So in this case, we actually, one thing I really want to stress with the approach.
Helen, sorry, Helen, sorry to cut you off. Could you speak just a little slower for the translators on the French side to pick up the language? Thank you very much.
Sorry.
Merci beaucoup.
Sorry, yes, I can try, I will approach that slightly slower. So yeah, I think the other thing to really stress when using remote sensing is that where possible, we recommend combining it with any on-the-ground data that might exist. This is taken from a study where we combine both the remote sensing with the AOK data mentioned above, as well as any face-to-face surveys that existed for some of the other locations that were more accessible. And looking at all of that data together, it can really better triangulate and understand what the actual impact is of the trends that we see through remote sensing. So if there's a reduction in rainfall, what does that mean for people on the ground? Thank you. And then finally to the last slide. So here I wanted to just talk through one area that I think is one that there's a lot of room for improvement, but also a lot of really interesting initiatives taking place. And I think it touches on some of the points raised in the previous discussions. It's about how NGOs can better collaborate with other actors and other stakeholders in order to make sure that the data is as effective as possible and meeting the needs of the population. So one aspect to this is affected populations, both in terms of ensuring that data is shared with them and findings and analysis is shared back, but also in terms of making sure that their voices are captured and better shown in the data and the findings and in the analysis. So one way that this can be done is by adding a qualitative element to monitoring of water access. So inviting people to give data in the way that many of us like to give data, which is to be able to explain our experiences, tell a story, give a narrative to it. This can allow for then an understanding of what the basic statistics that we have, what does that mean for the people on the ground? How do they experience that? And do they have suggested solutions to the problems? This is all extremely helpful for then turning that into improvements for people. Another area to think about this is data sharing and integration. How do we make sure that we are feeding into the national systems? How do we make sure our data is used by local governments, used by civil society, and owned as well in many cases? And one thing I think is absolutely critical on this point is thinking through collaboration right from start to finish of the research design. So not just data sharing at the end, but really discussing together what are the information gaps, what can different people bring to the table to help contribute to that, filling those information gaps, and how do we then design a study that properly captures that? How do we present the findings in a way that is useful? Like every step is one where collaboration is useful. And the very final point is on context analysis. Given that we often in a fragile context will be working in locations where there are existing patterns of violence or marginalization, how do we make sure that we ourselves do not perpetuate that and do not exclude people who are typically excluded? And the best way to think about that is to first of all understand the situation as well as possible. And that can then help design more inclusive and assessments that also very much stick to the principle of do no harm. So just a kind of emphasis there on the importance of analysis of the context and a full understanding before the design of the research. So that's the main points that I wanted to talk through today. Very excited to be talking through in the questions and answers, and thank you for your attention.
And thank you very much, Helen, and all other presenters. I respect and value the work that you're doing in the fragile and conflict-affected areas. And this is why, when we look at the current Joint Monitoring Program report, the group of countries that is in the real danger zone and stagnating on water coverage growth appears to be in fragile states. Reality is most of them are not going to be likely to be able to attain this goal. But this does not mean that as sector practitioners, and particularly when countries are coming out of conflict, doesn't mean that we do nothing about it, because when countries are coming out of conflict, there's need to build a legitimate state that is able to provide basic functions for its citizens. And this includes basic water supply. And these countries are also really looking forward to be able to come out of war. There's hope in fragile states and also conflict affected areas. And let me give an example of Somalia, where it's a country which has been in war for the past 30 years. It's such a long war. And I remember a conversation several years back with the Somalia Prime Minister, Abdiweli Mohammed Ali. And he said to me, Somalia is more than the hungry faces in the news, the pirates and the extremists. I foresee a bright future for Somalia. I foresee a Somalia matching other developed nations. I foresee a stable and progressive government that respects human rights. And this, it includes also the human right to water. So I believe if these people in fragile and conflict affected areas, if they believe this much in themselves, we as practitioners should be able to actually do further and even do more for them. I said this in the beginning that this is going to be a disruptive webinar. We rarely are having these conversations in the water sector, and I hope you can be able to feel it so far. So let us get in the question and answer session. And my first question is going to be going to the team from Haiti. What challenges has the government of Haiti overcome and still managing in connecting national priorities with SDG 6.1? Also, are there any changes in wash inequalities after strengthening SDG 6.1 monitoring in Haiti? Miriam, over to you.
D'accord, merci pour Scotia. En fait, Haïti, comme vous le dites, par rapport à l'activité qu'on est en train de faire sur le binaire, Haïti fait partie des zones difficiles, pays en conflit. Depuis 2020, la situation en Haïti est très compliquée. Il y a pas mal de zones rouges et cette situation d'insécurité vraiment a causé pas mal de soucis à la collecte de données pour alimenter l'ODD6. Par exemple, comme je l'avais dit lors de ma présentation, on utilise les données de l'inventaire des points d'eau pour dire s'ils sont fonctionnels ou pas, parce qu'en fonction des points d'eau fonctionnels, on peut faire des calculs pour dire quelle quantité de personnes qui peut être desservie. Et en fonction de ça, on peut continuer pour faire des analyses en termes d'accès. Avec ces zones difficiles qu'on peut pas, c'est pas les choses qui sont au niveau communal, surtout en milieu rural, ils se trouvent dans l'impossibilité d'avoir accès à ces zones-là. On dit zones rouges. Et ça a limité le nombre de données qu'on devrait analyser pour alimenter l'objectif de l'ODD6.
Thank you, Miriam. Just out of interest, what data are you failing to collect? SDG 6.1 data, are you failing to collect because of the fragile situation your country is in? What data specifically is proving very difficult to collect?
Par exemple, l'une des informations nécessaires qu'il nous faut, c'est la fonctionnalité de chaque point d'eau en Haïti, où ça se trouve au milieu rural, milieu urbain. Ces informations sont cruciales pour nous, pour savoir s'ils sont fonctionnels, si la qualité d'eau qu'ils donnent aussi, c'est potable, c'est bon. Il faut vraiment des visites pour collecter ces informations. C'est pour cette raison maintenant, avec les zones puisque il y a pas mal de problèmes d'insécurité, on se trouve dans l'impossibilité d'aller directement collecter certaines informations dans ces zones-là.
Okay, no, thank you very much. I think this is one of the issues we're very interested in. What indicators are you having to compromise on, but still have to make decisions in the context that you're in? I wanted then maybe just to jump to Annie as we're talking about the situation in Haiti. And Annie, during your presentation, one of the things you said, which I found very interesting, was that when you started out in the sector, people were saying, well, pencil is it's the best technology for governments, right? Are you seeing a shift in attitude when it comes to using technology, particularly in fragile states, and especially when it comes to trying to reduce water access inequalities? Are you seeing a shift from the pencil to actual technology?
Yes, and thank you for the question. I think Haiti is a great example that this is the poorest state in the Western Hemisphere, certainly undergoing a lot of conflict. This year, they finally hit, really the violence started inhibiting their abilities to monitor SDG 6 and their other KPIs. But over the past 5 years, despite 5 major emergencies, including the president's assassination, the oil shortage, COVID, two hurricanes and an earthquake, they increased their KPIs and were able to monitor with 100% monthly reporting. And how were they able to do that? With technology, with things like running their own hotspots to a computer, which is a wonderful technological advance just in the past 5 years that people have adopted as mainstream behavior. So if you look at technology has enabled fragile states to overcome the hurdles for monitoring that even development itself was preventing. And so the field has transitioned. In March at the UN conference, I joke and say it wasn't the UN Water Conference, it's the UN Water Data Conference, because data was part of every single session. And how is that possible? It's because everyone knows that it's a technology first discussion now.
No, thank you. It's interesting to see this shift because yes, I was there at the beginning when people were saying a pencil is sufficient. But now in these new circumstances, how do we adapt? And it seems that technology is making that shift. And I think it's actually very arrogant that people think governments should just use pencils. I mean, I think it's almost neo-colonial, as you said, that this idea that governments cannot adopt technology. And Miriam is a perfect example of that. Thank you very much. My next question will very quickly go to Helen. Helen, are you there? Your presentation
I will turn the video on.
Okay, great. A lot of your presentation really touched on some of your presentation, and there was a lot in it looking at remote sensing and collaborations and how those collaborations can actually work in fragile states. I was really interested in your work looking at NGOs and the role that NGOs can play. I think Euphrasia did mention that different stakeholders can come in to support governments. So looking at NGOs specifically and tapping from your work experience, how can NGOs support government to try to hasten the attainment of SDG 6, particularly in fragile states? And where possible, if there are any multi-sectoral structures that you've engaged with at any point, but mostly NGO engagement with government. How has that been?
Yes, I think this is a really good question. And honestly, I think it's one that I'm going to ask myself further, like based on this webinar. So I have my own sort of benefits from attending this as well. But a few examples I think that are really interesting are, I mentioned briefly that in food security, there's an example of when different groups come together, including both government experts and humanitarian actors, to all share data and discuss together and come to a technical consensus on a situation for each population of interest, and sort of essentially to categorize the food security situation there. So I think there's some interesting potential for similar approaches in other areas, thinking through how that might work with sort of more that triangulation, discussion stage, and the verification, that principle of like, how do we discuss together and come to a technical consensus on what this data means? I think that's one really interesting area. Another then would be like the making sure, as I said, that every step is designed in consultation. So really from the start to the end, and the start means the identification of the information gap, even like what's actually useful and what different skills does everyone bring to the table. So how would the best kind of, who's the best person to work on X, who's the best person to work on Y, and how they work together, like really taking it through each step, I think is something that's like generally leads to better practice in these areas.
Yeah, but this is often really difficult. I think like in the context of my country, where most organizations choose to go off and do work on their own without engaging government at all because they think government is too slow. But how can we really build that collaboration, especially when there are these rifts between these stakeholders?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think I'm actually just sort of further reflecting on this. I do think like some kind of accountability built in can be one way of approaching that. So making sure that it's in the design of projects, it's a critical, like part of the critical indicator that there must be like inclusion, discussion with government, data sharing. That's one way to ensure these things happen. As you said, like in the heat of the moment when there's a lot of pressure, sometimes people end up focusing on just the TORs of a project and not the overall impact. So kind of ensuring that these things are built into the accountability, I think, is one interesting approach. And I think the other is the more conversation, the more interaction, the better, because that just really builds up trust. I think a huge thing I found in some locations is that often when we would speak to local government people, they would say, you only come to us when you have a problem or you need sign off. Like you need to be speaking with us more, like, and that building up a relationship over good things too, sharing because you want to share and you want to discuss, not just because you need something. Just the more interaction, the better there. So
don't just show up when there's a problem. Interesting. If you want to quote Helen, that's a Helen. Don't only show up when there's a problem. Now, thank you for that. Over to you, Euphrasia.
Yeah, actually in the same breath, Russell is also asking on issues to do with data availability versus data accessibility. So we have a lot of data, but are we using it? Can we be able to access it, especially from government entities as well as from donors? I remember a conversation once on our RWSN platform where somebody was mentioning that, you know, if a donor has funded freely for data to be collected, it should be freely given. You should not have all these parameters or pay and all these things. Let it be available. And he says, is it not true that if data is amassed by governments and not accessible, that the data is wasted? It is. So no data, no finance, no water for all. Okay, let's move to the last question to UNICEF team. Citizen-driven measurement of SDG 6.1 has been championed by UNICEF since 2011. And I wanted to just know, and also from other participants, they want to also know, how are citizens contributing to data production for UNICEF? And how has it been helpful to the custodian of SDG 6.1 to date? And the SDG custodian 6.1 is UNICEF, by the way. Also speaking to the lagging progress on bringing on board quality data from WASH in schools, as well as WASH in health facilities. Over to you, Steve.
Hi, thank you. I hope you can see my video. I hope it's clear now.
Yes.
That's an interesting question. And what I could say is that since 2011, UNICEF, through the Global Innovation Center, we launched an SMS-based platform called U-Report. And being a technological platform, it attracted a lot of interest from young people and the youths. And when I last checked, that was in 2017, it had over 6 million users who were using the U-Reporting platform. It also then brought about opportunities to report on the SDGs in an open, inclusive, and participatory way. And there have been a number of pilots in using the U-Reporting platform in SDG reporting. I could give a case example of Zimbabwe, where they have the reporting, where they have the RIMS, Rural Water Supply Information Management System, which is used in Zimbabwe to track indicators on functionality of water sources, mostly in the rural areas. And there was an update to that system to use the reporting to have communities reporting on functionality of their water points, as well as reporting on any other issues in relation to maintenance of those water points. And a lot of data came through, which was quite interesting. And what we saw from that data was that, of course, communities were engaging, but there was always that need to have a qualified technician, or could I say enumerator, to go to that particular water point and validate that these are the challenges that this community is facing, and these are the issues that they has come through the reporting system that need to be validated. Similarly, it was used, the reporting system, it was used to engage with communities, particularly I could say, since it was being used by the youth in the urban areas. And it was used on service level benchmarking of water supply services. And they came up with an interesting indicator in terms of what was coming up in terms of reporting, in terms of the reliability score, that this information is reliable or not, and they had color coding systems to indicate that. So eventually, I think a lot of inputs can come through technological innovations, and they actually need to, they still need for it to be validated. But I think also coming up with a reliability score in terms of what has been reported could also be a good indicator on how much you can, on the extent to which you could trust the data that has been reported.
Unfortunately, Steve, sorry, because we're almost coming up to the end of the webinar.
Okay.
But yeah, so I'm sorry, I think you've raised a lot of interesting points there. Some people are already asking a lot of questions in the chat about the new reporting platform. So I would encourage all those who are interested in the new reporting platform, and also all the other interesting stuff Steve was talking about, to link up with him. We are going to share all the presentations that have been done today, and also this video. And also those who'd like to continue the conversation, we have other platforms where those conversations could take place. My apologies, Stephen, because we're coming up to the end of the webinar. My sister, Euphrasia, any last comments before we close off?
I always have a lot to say about the water sector. I can also see several people have a lot to say. Charles is wondering about capacity building and the likes. I want us to also use this opportunity to share what we could do differently at our own point and influence in power, with regards to ensuring that we have better SDG 6 monitoring for the fragile as well as the conflict affected areas. All I can say is thank you, everyone. Indeed, this webinar has been able to demonstrate that there is meaningful progress that can be made in providing basic services. In fact, the provision of basic services like water in fragile and conflict affected areas may help in rebuilding such states towards lasting peace and stability, which for me, from where I'm sitting again and from experience working in this context, is arguably even more meaningful than the question of attaining safe water for all. After all, we cannot be able to thrive in chaos. So thank you everyone for your participation, and we look forward to engaging you on further discussions. Thank you. Over to you, Muti.
Thank you, Euphrasia. As she has said, the conversation doesn't end here. This is to spark conversation beyond this webinar. And as mentioned, in the chat, there's a link that's been shared where all the presentations are going to be, and also the details of some of the speakers, some of our wonderful speakers, if you would like to link up with them to learn more about what they're doing. As mentioned, there are other upcoming webinars. This is the first of a series, and these are the dates of the upcoming webinars. We have 2 in June, 3 in June, actually, and it'll be every Tuesday at 20 past 2. And of course, these are the dates. So, and also moving to the next slide, those of you who would like to continue the conversation around issues to do with the opportunities and challenges of SDG 6 monitoring in fragile and conflict-affected states, the conversation will continue online. You can join any of these D groups. That is the Leave No One Behind D group. That's the link. Or the Data for Action D group, depending on your interest, as well as other groups that you can join. If you want to learn more about this topic, here are some of the links, and these will also be found on our website. But also we will share this webinar in case you want to refer back to it on Vimeo and YouTube. So on that note, I would like to thank all of you for joining from across the world, from China, India, Texas, Scotland, Sudan, all over the world. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for our wonderful speakers. If I could actually ask you to clap hands, I would have said a big hand for our speakers, but a big hand for you for staying with us. Join us next time for the next webinar, which will be in the month of June. And this is Muti on behalf of RWSN signing off. Thank you very much.